In order to properly attack the homeless issue, we have to understand that it is a complex issue, and it's not as simple as a bunch of vagrants who want to sit in cardboard boxes and lay in their own urine, drinking their lives away. But this is what the Trump administration wants us all to think. This is what the MAGAs all think. And this is what they are trying to pull off in this executive order that they've just recently signed from the White House. I will explain to you all the nuances and the complexities of the homelessness problem, including some very surprising things that will probably not be believed by the average MAGA who thinks that homelessness is all about laziness. My name is Scott Schneider. This is Fed Up in Minnesota. Before we go on with anything else, a short primer on the history of deinstitutionalization. Deinstitutionalization is the process of replacing long-stay psychiatric hospitals with less isolated community mental health services for those diagnosed with a mental disorder or developmental disability. In the 1950s and 60s, it led to the closure of many psychiatric hospitals as patients were increasingly cared for at home, in halfway houses, group homes, and clinics, in regular hospitals, or not at all. Deinstitutionalization works in two ways. The first focuses on reducing population size of mental institutions by releasing patients, shortening stays, and reducing both admissions and readmission rates. The second focuses on reforming psychiatric care to reduce or avoid encouraging feelings of dependency, hopelessness, and other behaviors that make it hard for patients to adjust to a life outside of care. The modern deinstitutionalization movement was made possible by the discovery of psychiatric drugs in the mid-20th century, which could manage psychotic episodes and reduce the need for patients to be confined and restrained. Another major impetus was a series of socio-political movements that campaigned for patient freedom. Lastly, there were financial imperatives, with many governments also viewing it as a way to save costs. We talk about the psychiatric drugs. The invention of imipramine, or the use of it, discovery of imipramine, which is a tricyclic antidepressant, and its effectiveness regarding the ability to help patients with depressed episodes was the beginning of the movement for psychiatric deinstitutionalization. The parent compound of imipramine was first synthesized in 1899, but no pharmacological assessment of this compound or any substituted derivatives was undertaken until the late 1940s. Imipramine was first synthesized in 1951 as an antihistamine. The antipsychotic effects of chlorpromazine were discovered in 1952, and imipramine was then developed and studied as an antipsychotic for use in patients with schizophrenia. The medication was tested in several hundred patients with psychosis, but showed little effectiveness. However, imipramine was serendipitously found to possess antidepressant effects in the mid-1950s following a case report of symptom improvement in a woman with severe depression who had been treated with it. This was followed by similar observations in other patients and further clinical research. Subsequently, imipramine was introduced for the treatment of depression in Europe in 1958, and in the United States in 1959, along with the discovery and introduction of monoamine oxidase inhibitor epinezide as an antidepressant around the same time. Imipramine resulted in the establishment of monoaminergic drugs as antidepressants. Then, the second part of this was the CIA experiments of the 1960s, called MKUltra, in which the CIA frighteningly used drugs and like LSD and other types of psychoactive compounds and tested them out on both volunteers and unwitting human people. Yes, we had the CIA, the government, secret experiments, and those experiments then resulted in numerous people being hurt and even some deaths. MKUltra was outed during the 1970s, and particularly during the Church Committee, in which during the Ford administration, the entire the sick and evil, disgusting parts of this whole reprehensible program were outed to Congress and were disseminated to Congress and made public, both witness testimony and public documents. MKUltra was what was the basic name for this CIA drug experimentation program, which tried to create and manipulate people's minds so that they could battle the Soviets and fight the Cold War. The author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Ken Kesey, actually was a volunteer for one of these MKUltra type of programs, where he at the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital, where he developed where he experienced the things that led him to the creation and writing of inspiration for the novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where he worked as a night aide, took psychoactive drugs on a volunteer basis to test out what the effects of them were on his mind. In fact, and he was also a leader in the deinstitutionalization movement as a result of not only what he experienced in those while he was a night aide in the psychiatric institution, but also because of the use of psychoactive drugs and his advocating for patient freedom to use those types of drugs. The National Alliance for Homelessness then defines housing first, so we know exactly what it is, because it's been practiced in this country for over 30 years. Housing first, Sam Simbaris, a clinical psychologist and then founder and CEO of a homeless services agency, developed Housing First in the 1990s to focus on housing as foundational to stability and not a reward for adherence to treatments. The Housing First approach is based on several principles: housing with no preconditions, housing and services, not housing only. People are presumed ready for housing, individualized and person-driven services. So it's the combination of people having problems and issues that are as complex as anything else in life, and being presented with the ability to be stabilized by obtaining housing and then working on those problems and getting support for those things while they are stabilized. I can speak myself to being homeless, as I spent an entire Wisconsin winter in my car due to my chronic illnesses that are now have led to my being declared disabled. And that is a horrible place and horrible condition to be in for anybody with any kind of destructive and dysfunctional medical issue. But myself being out on the street, or anybody who has any kind of chronic issue or problem being out on the street, is more disruptive to deal with than if you are housed and then are able to develop a strategy to take on those problems and work with support services or work on your own to get yourself in a better place. Unlike these jerk-offs, the ones that are in the MAGAs and the Trump administration, who sit around and victim blame people for the things they're struggling with being the reason why they're homeless. A character issue, something they didn't do right, a choice that they didn't make, took a wrong turn somewhere and decided they just wanted to throw the book out on life and decided that it wasn't worth getting up in the morning and carrying out a job and being a productive part of society. It's a joke. Instead, what Housing First does is it helps people stabilize their lives by getting a roof over their heads, one of the basic human rights and most important things people can have, so they can focus on the things that they are struggling with, along with the supports that are given them and the programs available to them, or the people who they can engage with that may help them over those humps to become more productive, either more productive citizens or live stabilized lives with their conditions. What a novel concept. That's true compassion, Donald Trump, not your bullshit Nazi propaganda crap. People should be connected to supportive services ranging from help with housing stability to clinical interventions such as mental health care and treatment for substance use disorder. And that's not the only thing. People don't need to prove themselves should languish in shelters, which are a joke anyway, and spend a certain amount of time in transitional housing. Getting people into housing faster is better for them and cheaper for taxpayers, because we're not spending money on all these programs that are just people in and out, in and out, in and out, including the prison system. And they're individualized. People who have lived experience, who have been homeless themselves, should be heard because they usually have good ideas for helping end homelessness. But we don't want to do that because, we're a bunch of bigots sitting in the MAGA party, want to paint everybody who's homeless as a bunch of useless vagrants who want to sit around, thumb up their ass, and eat out of a garbage can. Connecticut housing advocates fear fallout from Trump executive order criminalizing homelessness. This is from the New England Public Media, which is basically an NBR perspective from New England. President Donald Trump's executive order on homelessness calls for the institutionalization or imprisonment of people found sleeping outdoors. It also forces treatment on unhoused individuals suffering from mental illness and addiction. Connecticut Governor Ned Lamont denounced the executive order Monday. President Trump, homelessness is not a crime, not here in Connecticut, and not in America, Lamont said. But Connecticut Housing Advocates, a coalition of housing nonprofits, says Lamont's condemnation of the order isn't enough action. We appreciate Governor Lamont's words, but will not be hardened until we see him act, the advocates said in a statement. We cannot address homelessness without housing, and we cannot build enough housing until we start to tear down the red tape and regulatory barriers purposefully erected by many local officials who choose not to permit home construction in their towns, and the oligarchy that raises prices and wants to price the crap out of people so only their rich buddies can obtain housing. Homelessness service providers, lawmakers, and housing advocates are rallying around the unhoused community, appeasing fears regarding this order. Only about 30% of those experiencing homelessness in Connecticut report serious mental illness, and fewer than 1 in 5 report a substance use disorder, according to Nancy Navarrete, Commissioner of the State Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. That means the vast majority are simply people facing poverty, housing shortages, and systemic inequities, which happens all over this damned country, especially in this regime. Democratic Representative Joe Courtney says there won't be an immediate change in Connecticut law. It's premised on the notion that somehow he has the right to federalize and criminalize regardless of the fact that most of the issues are really subject to state and local control, Courtney said. Indeed, we have all kinds of proof that people are out there, just normal average Americans trying to make a living, families, parents, and regular adults with full-time jobs, not able to hold housing because they can't afford it. What concept? A journalist named Brian GOLDSTONE just put out a book just very recently, over the past few months, where he chronicles 5 different families just in the Atlanta area alone whose parents are working full-time jobs and their entire families are homeless. Here's the book. It's called The Working Homeless. And this is a notion that has been around for quite some time now. The understanding that there are people who do everything they can, and yet they still end up out in the streets. I was one of those people. Watching the train wreck, watching myself careen off a cliff. I couldn't stop because nobody would help me, even though I did everything I could to help and support and make sure that I had some kind of ability to hit the brakes. But nobody let me hit the brakes. And I just careened off the cliff and lived an entire Wisconsin winter out of a car. with chronic illness. So it's because another form of creeping fascism, due to Donald Trump and the MAGA party, trying to institute and control, criminalize homeless people, blaming them on it being their fault, being on mental illness, on substance abuse, as if they've created the issue themselves. And in this creeping fascism, this executive order was launched, does everything in its power to start to blame the disabled, the homeless, substance abuse, etc., minorities and everybody else who are strung out in the street as being the ones who are the undesirables, the ones who don't deserve to be out there, are just getting in the way of society. And this is the beginning, another facet, another leg of fascism rearing its ugly head, in which the weak and the supposedly unproductive to society, the useless eaters, deserve to be kicked out and put into what looks like detention camps, according to the executive order, because where else are they going to go? When people were deinstitutionalized in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, they were supposed to get community help. But the Republicans specifically have always blocked funding for community services for people with mental illness and substance abuse, and now it's spilling over into the homeless who are working because there are no facilities. So good luck, Donald Trump, getting people to be housed in facilities to help them overcome their substance abuse habit. You are setting this up on purpose, because what else is left if there's no housing available? And you know this is the case, that there isn't supportive housing available or services available for the people you victim blame. Detention camps and centers, which you are now building for the illegals. And once you get through those, you're going to turn your attention to the undesirables, the homeless and disabled, the weak people out on the streets that you consider not at all a necessary part of this society. My name is Scott Schneider, and I am fed up in Minnesota.